Hello, and welcome back, or welcome if you're here for the first time. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're returning or just discovering the channel, I hope you'll find these stories a place to rest your mind as you wind down. My name is Mr. Dantello, and tonight we're exploring something that unsettles us in a quieter way. The kind of horror that lives in doubt and uncertainty. These are stories about the mind itself, about moments when reality feels less solid than we thought it was. Psychological and mind-bending tales that linger long after they end. Tonight, we have 3 stories for you. First, we're looking at something deeply personal. I keep finding receipts for purchases I don't remember making. A story about the creeping unease of losing pieces of your own memory. Then we'll move into something architectural and strange. The office building's basement floor isn't on any of the blueprints, where what should exist on paper simply doesn't. And finally, we'll explore something deeply intimate. My reflection started blinking at different times than I do. A story about noticing that the person looking back at you might not quite be in sync. If you enjoy these stories, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider liking and subscribing. It means everything, and it helps others find their way here too. Now, before we settle in, make yourself comfortable. Find a position that feels right. Dim the lights if you'd like, and let yourself relax into these stories. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. I keep finding receipts for purchases I don't remember making. I've been organizing the same jacket for 3 weeks. It's a charcoal linen thing I wear in autumn. The sleeves a little too long, pockets deep enough to swallow things whole. I wear it most days when I'm moving between client meetings or meeting myself at the coffee shop to pretend I work somewhere other than my kitchen table. The pocket was bunched up. That's what started it. The fabric folded wrong against my ribs all morning. And finally, around noon, I reached in to smooth it and my fingers caught on paper. A receipt. Thermal paper, the kind that feels thin and temporary. I didn't think much of it then. I'm the kind of person who accumulates receipts like some people accumulate lint. I spend money in the quiet, methodical way that freelancers do, tracking expenses for taxes, for quarterly estimates, for the general paranoia of being self-employed. I pulled it out and glanced at the date. 3 weeks ago, almost exactly. Bose Quiet Comfort 45 headphones. $299. I stopped walking. I was in the hallway between my bedroom and kitchen, that narrow corridor where the light never quite reaches the corners, and I stood there holding this receipt with the store logo at the top and the timestamp reading 7:47 p.m. And I felt something small and cold roll through my chest. I didn't remember buying headphones. This should have been straightforward, a false memory, some mix-up. But my first thought wasn't confusion. It was verification. I walked directly to my desk, to the drawer where I keep things I use daily. Ear pods, phone chargers, a wireless mouse. And there, at the back, still in the box, the exact headphones on the receipt. Silver, sealed, untouched except for the way the cardboard was creased at the corner, which suggested I or someone had picked it up and set it down. I opened the box. Inside, everything was perfect. Coiled cables, warranty card, the little instruction booklet no one reads. The smell of new plastic moved up into my face, clean and synthetic and impossible to ignore. I had owned these headphones for 3 weeks without knowing it. That's what bothered me most. Not the absence of memory exactly, but the presence of everything else. The receipt, the box, the exact size and color I would have chosen, the price. I'm not someone who forgets purchases. I'm someone who tracks them. I photograph receipts, file them, cross-reference them against my bank statements. It's obsessive, maybe, but I'm alone in this apartment, and the rituals of accounting are a kind of company. I sat on the edge of my bed with the headphones in my lap and tried to reason backward. The date on the receipt, September 14th. That was a Wednesday. I was home that day, I remember, because I'd had a video call with the Aldridge account at 4 in the afternoon, and I remember because the project was still open on my computer. So I'd been here, in this apartment, possibly in this same room. But I hadn't left the apartment that day. I was certain of that. I don't go out on Wednesdays unless I have to. So if the headphones were purchased at 7:47 p.m. on September 14th, and I didn't leave the apartment, and I didn't order them online, then the thought didn't finish. Instead, I set the headphones back in their box and went to return them to the drawer. That was my immediate impulse. Put the strange thing away, fold it back into the architecture of my apartment, and pretend it was a glitch in my own memory. A gap. People have gaps. Memory is unreliable. Everyone forgets things. I told myself this while closing the drawer. I told myself this while standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker on the counter, which I'd had for at least a year, maybe longer, certainly not 3 weeks. I told myself this while returning to my desk and opening my laptop to check my bank account, which I did not do, because checking my bank account for evidence of my own behavior felt like admitting something. Instead, I worked. That's what I do. I work. I opened the design file for a packaging project, margins and color space, decisions made by someone else that I'm being paid to refine. I worked until the light changed outside my window. From afternoon to early evening, the gray settling in the way it does in October. The city sounds from below, traffic, someone's music, the ambient noise of other people's lives provided the background, and I moved my mouse and clicked and dragged shapes until the edges of the room grew soft. Around 8 o'clock, I made dinner, toast and eggs and a cup of tea. I sat at my small table facing the wall, not the window, because I liked the ritual of it, the repetition. Eggs on toast at 8 o'clock. This is what Morgan does on a Wednesday evening, or a Tuesday, or a Saturday. The specifics don't matter. The pattern is what matters. After dinner, I moved to the couch. There's a book I've been reading, something literary and slow, the kind of thing that doesn't demand much but asks you to sit with it anyway. I opened my bookmark somewhere in the middle and read 2 pages without absorbing anything. The words moved across the page. I turned to page 3. That's when I found the second receipt. It was a bookmark, actually, thin thermal paper. Same as the other, but this time it was positioned deliberately, protruding from the top of the book like someone had carefully placed it there to mark the page. The date was fresher, October 3rd. Just over a week ago. Breville Smart Grind Burr Coffee Maker. $427. I sat very still. The book was open in my lap, the receipt in my hand, and I could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. Its low mechanical hum that you only notice when everything else is quiet. The coffee maker sat on my counter. I'd seen it this morning. I'd used it this morning. The grounds were still in the filter basket. The carafe warmed to the touch when I poured my last cup before settling down to work. I owned a $427 coffee maker that I also did not remember purchasing. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I folded the receipt and set it on the side table next to the lamp. Then I picked it up again. The name of the store was printed across the top in a particular serif font. The transaction number was a long string of digits. The time was 3:47 a.m. on October 3rd, the previous Thursday. While I slept, I opened my laptop and pulled up my email. I didn't remember getting a shipping confirmation, but I might not have. I went to my banking app, something I'd been avoiding, and scrolled through the transactions. There it was, October 3rd. Breville, $427.43. And before that, September 14th. Bose, $299.99. Both were there. Both were real. Both had been charged to the credit card I'd had for 4 years. The one that comes in and out of my wallet. The one I use for everything. I scrolled further back, moving through the dates. My regular purchases appeared, groceries, design software, the occasional book, the usual debris of my spending. Then, between the regular transactions, I started to see them. New ones, unexpected ones. A receipt dated September 28th. 6:12 a.m. Everlane cashmere cardigan, the exact charcoal color I always choose. $148. The sweater was upstairs in my drawer, folded neatly, still with the tag attached. Another one, September 22nd. 2:34 a.m. Reese crop trousers navy, $189. I owned those. I was wearing similar ones right now, in fact. The fit was perfect. Another September 18th, 4:09 a.m. diptyque base candle, $68. The candle was in my bedroom unlit on the shelf above my nightstand. The receipts multiplied as I scrolled, each one a small violation of the architecture of my own memory. Each one a purchase made in the dead hours, while I slept, while my mind was somewhere else. Each one was something I would choose. Each one was something I had already received. Each one was real in every way, except for the one way that mattered, the way I had chosen it. I closed the laptop. I needed to think. I needed air. I stood up, and the book fell from my lap onto the floor, pages bent, the bookmark receipts sliding out and floating down like snow. The apartment suddenly felt very small. The walls seemed closer than they had that morning. The hallway between my bedroom and kitchen seemed longer, or maybe just darker. The light from the living room not quite reaching the far end. I could see the kitchen tile from where I stood, pale gray and clean, and beyond that, the edge of the counter where the coffee maker sat, its glass carafe reflecting the ceiling light in a smooth, distorted curve. I counted the receipts I'd found, 2 in hand. But how many were there? How much of my life had I purchased without knowing it? I went to my bedroom. The drawers opened quietly. I keep them well organized, almost obsessively so. One drawer for shirts, one for underwear, one for accessories, another for the things I'm not sure where else to put, scarves, gloves, a belt someone gave me years ago. I opened each one slowly, running my fingers over the edges of the clothes, feeling the fabric, trying to remember the particular moment of purchase. Trying and failing. In the closet, shoes I didn't remember buying. A jacket in my size and a style I would wear. A dress, still tagged, in a pattern that looked familiar but which I had no memory of selecting from a rack or a screen. My nightstand drawer. I opened it without thinking, and there, beneath the booklight and a pen and a notepad I use for jotting down design ideas I have at night, was another receipt. This one somehow felt different. The thermal paper was cooler than it should have been, though that might have been imagination. The date was fresh. October 11th. This morning, 4:02 a.m. But the receipt was for something that shouldn't exist yet. Something not yet purchased, or perhaps not yet delivered. The description was unclear, the name of the item obscured in the way thermal paper degrades, the text fading into the background of the paper itself. I held it up to the lamp, tried to read the letters, but they wouldn't come into focus. The sum was visible, though, $1,247.89. $1,247.89 for something I couldn't quite read, purchased while I slept, for reasons I couldn't explain. I sat on the edge of my bed, and the mattress dipped in that familiar way, the way it dips every night when I come to sleep. The window was dark now. Outside, the city continued its evening. People moving through their routines, their own accountable lives, their own memories that they could trust. Inside, in this small room with its familiar furniture and familiar walls, I held a receipt for something that didn't exist yet, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that something in my life had become untethered. Something or someone was buying things in my name, in my exact taste, things that fit perfectly because they were chosen for me by someone who knew exactly what I would like, someone who had access to my credit cards while I slept, someone who moved through my apartment in the dark hours, who knew my drawer organization, who knew the color I preferred, the size that fit, someone who was, in every measurable way, me, but I was here. I was awake. I was the one holding the receipt. So who was the one buying? I looked at the receipt again, trying to force the text into focus. The description flickered in and out of legibility. For just a moment, I thought I could read it. A name. Something that started with. But then I blinked, and the thermal paper returned to its usual illegibility, and I was alone in my bedroom with only my own pulse in my ears and the realization, settling slowly like sediment, that I could no longer trust my memory to be my own. The apartment smelled different the next morning, not unpleasant, something like laundry detergent, the kind I buy, the brand I've always bought. But I hadn't washed anything. The smell was strongest near the closet, as though someone had walked through the space and left a wake of it, like a question mark hanging in the air. I opened the closet door. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. The clothes hung in that casual order I'd established months ago, work clothes on the left, everything else fading into blacks and grays toward the right. The shoes lined the floor. The shelf above held the usual boxes. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. But something had moved through this space. The smell told me that much. I tried to convince myself there was an explanation. Perfume settling. A window opened somewhere carrying a neighbor's laundry into my walls. My own nose playing tricks, finding patterns in randomness because the human brain is built to do exactly that. We are creatures of narrative. We need stories. We need cause and effect. We can't tolerate the thought that things simply happen without meaning. But I had found 4 more receipts by afternoon. The first was in the kitchen, wedged between the refrigerator and the counter. The thermal paper had faded almost completely. Only a date was visible and a partial transaction number. I'd checked my credit card statement. The charges were there. All of them. Every single one. Categorized and confirmed, each one processed at 3:47 and according to the timestamps. The second receipt was in the bathroom medicine cabinet, tucked behind a bottle of pain relief medication that was the same brand I normally used, the same dose, the same count per bottle. It was full. I'd never opened it. The receipt beneath it was equally illegible, but the amount was listed, $89.43. The third fell out of the mailbox as I opened it. This one was slightly different. A shipping label, not a receipt, with a delivery confirmation that said the package had been left in my unit's mailway. I checked the mailway. I found nothing. The fourth was the strangest. I found it on the bathroom counter, placed so precisely on the white tile that it seemed almost intentional, like it had been left for me to find, like a message. The paper was still slightly warm to the touch. I didn't remember going to the bathroom at 3:47 a.m. I didn't remember leaving the apartment. I didn't remember anything between falling asleep the night before and waking at my usual time. 6:17 a.m., the light still gray, the city still mostly silent, my alarm not yet sounding, but my body felt tired in a different way, a used way. My shoulders ached slightly, the soles of my feet were sore, as though I'd walked somewhere, as though I'd stood in one place for a long time. I started keeping a log. Not because I thought it would help, I already knew something was fundamentally wrong, but because the act of recording things felt like the last way I could assert control. On Monday, I made a note of my sleep time, my wake time, any dreams I could remember. On Tuesday, I did the same. I also began locking the bedroom door from the inside. It felt ridiculous even as I did it, the kind of thing a child would do when frightened of the dark. The lock was a simple push-button mechanism, the kind that could be opened from the outside with a flathead screwdriver. But it was something. It was a gesture. It was me telling whatever was happening in my apartment during the sleeping hours that I was aware, that I was paying attention. On Tuesday night, the lock held. I woke at 2:33 and with my heart racing, unsure what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark. The door was locked. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. But the air was different, warmer, as though someone had been breathing in the room only moments before. as though the space was still holding the presence of another person, slowly cooling back to normal temperature, like an indentation in a mattress that gradually returns to its original shape. I lay in the dark for 3 hours, listening for footsteps in the hallway, listening for the sound of keys in the lock, listening for my own voice, moving through my apartment, buying things I wouldn't remember in the morning. I heard nothing. The apartment was silent, in that complete unnatural way that silence can be, the kind of silence that has a quality to it, a presence, like it's a thing in itself rather than the absence of sound. At 5:47 a.m., I got up and searched the apartment from end to end. I opened every drawer. I looked inside every cabinet. I checked behind the furniture. I looked for anything new, anything that shouldn't be here, anything that might give me a clue about what was being purchased in my name while I slept. I found nothing new, nothing out of place, just my ordinary life arranged exactly as I'd always arranged it. The receipts had stopped appearing. I found no new ones on Wednesday or Thursday. The absence of them was somehow worse than their presence. It meant whatever was happening had stopped leaving evidence. It meant it was becoming more careful, more intentional. On Friday morning, I discovered something that made my entire understanding of the situation shift like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface. I'd gone to the bathroom around 7 o'clock, moving through my morning routine on autopilot. As I was washing my hands, I happened to glance at my face in the mirror. Just a glance, a moment of contact with my own reflection. But for just a fraction of a second, small enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, my reflection had not mirrored my movement. It had looked at me. Its expression had changed. Its eyes had moved first, the way a person's eyes move when they're about to turn their head to look at something that has caught their attention. And then the moment was over. The reflection was me again, my face reflected exactly as it should be, my hand frozen in place under the running water, my expression caught in mid-turn as I looked toward the mirror. I turned off the water and looked again. Just myself. Just my tired face and my confused expression in the bathroom exactly as it should be. But I couldn't convince myself that I'd imagined it. The feeling of being looked at had been too distinct. The sense of someone else's attention landing on me from inside the glass had been too real. It lingered in my chest like a cold hand pressed against my ribs from the inside. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching the clock move toward 3:47 a.m., watching the hours accumulate, waiting for something to happen, waiting to hear the sound of my own key in the lock, waiting to hear my own footsteps moving through my apartment, buying things I would forget about in the morning. But nothing happened. The apartment remained quiet, and I remained awake and afraid and somehow certain that the worst part wasn't that something was buying things in my name. The worst part was that I was beginning to understand why it had access to everything it needed. The worst part was that the receipts had shown me something I hadn't fully comprehended until now. The purchases were always exactly what I would have chosen. Always in the exact size I would have preferred. always in the color I would have picked if I'd been the one making the decision, which meant that whatever was using my credit cards didn't need to study me. It didn't need to observe me or deduce my preferences. It already knew everything I liked because it knew exactly how I thought. Because maybe, just maybe, it was me. I didn't leave my apartment on Saturday. There was no rational reason to. I'd called in sick to work on Friday afternoon, my voice hollow and unconvincing even to myself. My supervisor hadn't asked questions. I think people can hear it when something has come loose inside someone else. They sense the fracture and stay away from it. By Saturday morning, I'd stopped trying to sleep. The exhaustion had moved beyond fatigue into something else, a clarity that felt almost chemical, as if my brain had burned through every normal frequency and was now operating on some emergency wavelength that made everything appear in sharp, unforgiving detail. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I made tea and watched it go cold. I sat on my couch and held my phone in my hand, refreshing my bank account every few minutes, as if the numbers might change while I was watching, as if I could somehow prevent the next purchase through sheer vigilance. The receipts didn't come, but I found myself afraid of that too. The silence felt like something gathering, like pressure building behind a dam. Around noon, I went to my bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. Everything was where I'd left it. My toothbrush in its holder, my deodorant, a bottle of ibuprofen I'd bought 3 months ago, the same bottle of ibuprofen that was still 3/4 full. I knew this because I never took ibuprofen. I never had. Even as a child, I'd avoided it. Something about the taste made my stomach turn. My mother had learned this when I was 7, and it had simply been filed away in the family knowledge as a fact about me. The kind of small truth that accumulates and becomes part of how people understand you. But the bottle was newer than 3 months. The expiration date said it had been manufactured 6 months ago. I unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. The tablets inside were exactly what they should be. Small, white, unmarked on one side. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why I owned something I'd never wanted, something I would never have purchased, unless someone else had. Unless someone who thought they were me, who actually believed they were me, had gone into a pharmacy and made a decision that the real me would never make. I put the bottle back and closed the cabinet. My reflection stared out from the mirror, and I didn't look at it. I was afraid to look at it. I was afraid of what it might do now that the pretense was thinning. Now that the distance between what was happening and what I could explain away had collapsed into nothing. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed. The sheets were rumpled in a way I didn't remember rumpling them. The pillow on the left side, the side I never used, the side that faced away from the door, had an indent in it, a head-shaped absence where someone had rested their head. But I lived alone. I'd always lived alone. I touched the indent. It was still slightly warm. Something inside me broke then, not violently, not with drama, just a quiet separation, like ice fracturing silently in deep water. The part of me that had been trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy simply let go. I pulled out my laptop and opened the credit card statements for the past 6 months. Then further, a year, 18 months, The purchases were there, scattered at first, then increasingly frequent, a pattern emerging from what I'd thought was random noise. What I saw made me understand the shape of the problem. The purchases clustered around certain times, certain hours, always between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., always on nights when I believed I'd been sleeping, always buying things that required knowledge of my deepest preferences, not just surface preferences, what I'd order from a restaurant, what color I'd choose if forced to choose, but deeper things, things I'd only know about myself through reflection, through thinking about what I actually wanted underneath the habitual decisions I made every day. And then I found something that changed everything. There was a series of purchases from a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment, the same coffee shop I walked past every morning on my way to work. Charges of $6.47 each, appearing at 2:14 and on multiple occasions. At first, they seemed random. Then I saw the pattern. The charges appeared on nights when I'd had particularly vivid dreams, nights when I'd woken briefly in the early morning hours, disoriented and confused, with the taste of something strange still on my tongue. I put my laptop down. My hands were shaking too badly to type. It was Tuesday night when something shifted again. I'd spent the past 3 days in a state of paralyzed waiting, checking my apartment for signs of intrusion, finding nothing, finding everything. The door was always locked, the windows sealed, but there were small things. My bookshelf rearranged in a way that made more logical sense than how I'd organized it. My kitchen utensils in a different drawer, but the new arrangement was more efficient. My closet sorted by color instead of by frequency of wear, which was objectively better. At 2:47 a.m., I heard something, not the sound of a key in the lock, not footsteps, something quieter and more disturbing, the sound of my shower turning on, not in the distance, not through walls, in my bathroom, water running, steam beginning to rise and curl under the gap beneath the bathroom door. I was frozen in my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought my chest might cave in. Every rational thought I'd held on to, the possibility of a gas leak causing hallucinations, the likelihood of my apartment being broken into without evidence, the chance that I was experiencing some kind of dissociative episode, all of it crystallized into something worse. The rational explanations were gone. What remained was the understanding that I'd been avoiding since Friday morning. I got out of bed with movements that felt alien and distant, as if I was controlling my body through a very slight delay, as if I was watching myself move rather than moving myself. I walked to the bathroom door and stood in front of it. The door was closed, the light underneath was on, the sound of water continued, steady and deliberate. I put my hand on the doorknob. It was warm. "Hello," I said. My voice sounded different in my own ears. Unfamiliar, the water stopped immediately, not gradually, not as if someone had reached over and turned the knob. It simply ceased, as if someone had been waiting for permission to stop, as if the sound had only continued because I wasn't facing it directly. I stood in the darkness of my bedroom, my hand on the doorknob of my bathroom, and I understood something that hollowed me out from the inside. There was someone in there, someone who moved through my apartment at night, Someone who knew my preferences and my passwords and the exact way I liked my kitchen organized. Someone who had access to my credit cards and my keys and my life. Someone who thought exactly like me because they were exactly like me. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that I didn't know if I was the one in the bedroom or the one in the shower. I didn't know which of us had woken up in my bed this morning. I didn't know which of us had spent the last 3 days checking receipts and opening medicine cabinets and trying to understand what was happening. All I knew was that somewhere in this apartment at 2:47 in the morning, both of me were awake. And one of me was standing in the dark with my hand on the doorknob, while the other stood in the shower with the lights on. And neither of us knew which one had the right to be here. I turned the doorknob. The door was locked from the inside. In the bathroom, the light switched off. I don't remember leaving the bathroom door. I don't remember walking back to my bed or lying down or closing my eyes. But at some point, the night simply ended the way nights do. Not with dawn breaking spectacularly, but with the simple, gradual return of ordinary light through my bedroom window. The sky shifted from black to gray to something approximating blue. The birds started their morning argument in the trees outside. The world continued existing whether I understood it or not. I lay very still and waited to see who would get up. After what might have been 20 minutes or might have been 2 hours, I sat up. My body obeyed. My legs moved. I felt the familiar cold of the hardwood floor beneath my feet, a sensation that was mine, that I recognized. That confirmed my presence in the world. I was the one awake. I was the one thinking this. I was almost certain. I didn't go to the bathroom. Not that morning. Not for most of the day. When I finally opened that door, around noon, everything was normal. The shower was dry. There were no wet footprints on the tile. The mirror was clear and ordinary, reflecting only my own confused face looking back at me, tired, hollow-eyed, but unchanged. No one else looked back from the glass. Just me, just the person I've always been. Presumably I looked for evidence. Wet towels, damp tiles, some indication that something had used that shower at 2:47 in the morning. But there was nothing. The apartment gave me nothing. It was silent and clean and perfectly arranged. My bookshelf still in its logical order. My kitchen utensils in their efficient drawers. My closet organized by color. All the improvements remained. All the small proofs that someone else had been here, thinking my thoughts, making my choices. The water bill hasn't changed. I checked. 3 days later, I called the water company and asked if there had been unusual usage. The representative told me everything was normal, within range, nothing anomalous. I went back to work on Monday. I called in sick on Friday and spent the weekend doing very little, sitting in my apartment, listening to the silence, wondering which parts of me belonged to the person who lived here, and which parts belonged to the other one, or if there was even a difference anymore. My manager asked if I was feeling better. I said yes. I must have sounded convincing because he didn't ask any follow-up questions. Things have mostly returned to normal. The receipts stopped appearing after that night. I haven't found any new purchases I don't remember making, any charges that don't belong to me. The fraudster, if that's what I was ever looking for, has gone quiet, or retired, or is content with what they've already taken. I sleep through most nights now without waking. Most nights I fall asleep and simply exist in that unconscious state until morning comes and drags me back. It's easier that way. Less time to think about who fell asleep and who woke up. My apartment is very organized now. It stays that way. I don't reorganize anything myself. I've stopped caring enough to rearrange things back to how I remember them, but nothing moves anymore either. The other person, if there ever was another person, isn't making improvements, or isn't here anymore, or perhaps realized that they'd already optimized everything to perfection and there was nothing left to change. Sometimes I stand in front of my bathroom mirror and really look at my face. I catalog the details. The small scar on my left eyebrow from when I was 8. The way my right eye is slightly smaller than my left. The barely there freckle on my collarbone that I've never really liked. These are the things that make me me. These are the details that distinguish this body, this face, this person from any other. If someone else lived in this apartment, surely they would look different. Surely I would be able to tell them apart. But the thing is, and this is the part that keeps me awake on nights when I manage to stay conscious, I can't actually remember what my face looked like before all of this started. I can remember descriptions of it. I can remember what people have told me about it. But my own memory of it, #expanded middle section. I keep finding receipts for purchases. I don't remember making the apartment felt different after that third receipt. Not obviously different. Nothing had moved. The furniture still occupied the same corners. The kitchen still faced east where the morning light turned everything the color of old honey. But there was a texture to the air that hadn't been there before, a quality like the space itself was listening. I started paying attention to the apartment in ways I hadn't before. Not the way you notice your living room in daylight, cataloging its function and familiarity. This was different. This was the kind of attention you give to a room you're about to leave forever, trying to commit details to memory, because something in your gut tells you that later you'll need proof this place was real. The hallway leading to my bedroom had always seemed standard length, maybe 12 feet from the living room threshold to where my bedroom door began. But now, I found myself counting my steps each time I walked it. 13 steps, sometimes 14, never 12. The discrepancy was small enough that I questioned whether I'd ever actually measured it properly, whether my sense of distance through a dark hallway had ever been reliable. The walls were a neutral off-white, slightly yellowed near the ceiling where smoke from previous tenants had stained the paint. When I walked slowly, I could see the texture of the drywall, thousands of tiny peaks and valleys that caught the light from the living room behind me and cast minute shadows. In those shadows, there seemed to be patterns, nothing intentional, nothing you could call a shape. But the way the light fell made me feel like the walls were almost communicating something just beyond the threshold of understanding. My bedroom mirror faced the bed. Standard placement. Standard mirror, nothing ornate. just a rectangular pane in a thin wooden frame that I'd picked up at a second-hand store 3 years ago. I'd stopped using it to check my appearance sometime around the second receipt, though I couldn't remember making a conscious decision to do so. It simply began to feel like an intrusion to look at myself in it. The surface had developed a faint cloudiness in its lower left corner, the kind of age spot that mirrors develop over time, where the silvering wears thin and reflects nothing but a pale, dead gray. I noticed that when I entered my room in the evening, the angle of my body in that mirror never quite matched the angle I felt myself occupying. A slight lag, a half-second delay, probably an optical illusion born from peripheral vision and the particular physics of reflection. Probably something my brain was inventing because I was looking for something to fear. The kitchen became a place where I lingered without purpose. I'd open the refrigerator and stand in its light, the cool air washing over my face, my hand on the door handle, staring at the shelves. The milk was the same brand I always bought. The vegetables in the crisper drawer showed no signs of spoilage I didn't cause myself. The leftover containers held food in various states of age, all of which I could account for, all of which I remembered preparing. But something about the way the light from inside the fridge illuminated the kitchen made me feel like I was looking at the space from the wrong angle, like I was seeing it from a position 3 feet to my left, and only my peripheral vision was receiving the accurate information. The sink had a particular quality that began to disturb me. When I ran water, the stainless steel would reflect the kitchen window, the counter, the hanging cabinet doors. But in certain moments, with the light hitting at a particular angle, the reflection seemed to lag fractionally behind the actual movement of my hand. I'd move my hand under the faucet, and the reflected hand would follow a beat later, as though the sink surface was processing the image with a slight delay. I knew this wasn't possible. I knew reflection was instantaneous. But knowing and believing were beginning to separate in my mind, like two diverging roads that I could see were different destinations. The living room windows were the worst. They faced the street below, and I'd always liked looking out at the neighborhood in the evening, watching the particular choreography of people walking home from work, the way the streetlights gradually brightened as dusk deepened. But now, when I looked out those windows, I couldn't quite reconcile what I was seeing with what I expected to see. The buildings across the street seemed to be in slightly different positions than my memory suggested they should be. Not dramatically different. A few feet, perhaps a storefront that I thought was on the corner was actually 3 doors down. A fire escape that I remembered being on the left side of a fade was on the right. These were small corrections to my internal map of the neighborhood, but they accumulated. They suggested that either my memory was catastrophically unreliable, or something about the world outside my windows had shifted and then settled into a new configuration. I began spending time simply sitting on my couch, facing the window, trying to understand the geography of the street below. I developed what felt like a rational approach to the problem. I'd look at a landmark, a distinctive mailbox, a particular tree with an unusual shape, and I'd memorize its position relative to my building. The mailbox was approximately 40 feet to the left of the base of my building's entrance. The tree was across the street, roughly 30 feet further down the block. These measurements felt solid, factual, the kind of information a brain could hold on to. And then, the next day, I'd look again and the mailbox would have migrated. Not moved in the sense of being physically relocated. Appeared to have shifted, as though my memory had been corrected by some external force while I slept. The quality of the silence in the apartment changed as the evenings deepened. There was a particular density to it that seemed to accumulate as the night progressed. By midnight, the silence felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, something with weight and texture, pressing against the walls from the outside. I could hear the building's infrastructure, the occasional gurgle of pipes in the walls, the settling of the structure, the hum of the refrigerator that suddenly seemed louder and more insistent than it had in the past. But underneath these sounds, or perhaps behind them, there was something else. A quality to the silence that suggested it was manufactured, maintained, held in place by something I couldn't quite access. My bed developed an odd quality as well. The mattress, which had always felt reasonably comfortable, began to feel like it was subtly unstable, like the surface was undulating beneath me even when I lay perfectly still. The sensation would fade if I didn't think about it, but the moment I became aware of it, it would return. A gentle, rhythmic quality, barely perceptible, as though the mattress was breathing. The sheets, which I washed weekly, would feel textured in new ways. Threads that should have been smooth seemed to have developed a slight granularity. In the darkness, when I ran my hand across them, it felt like running my palm across something organic, like skin or the settled grain of bark. I'd throw the sheets off, turn on the light, and they'd appear perfectly normal. But in the darkness, the texture would return. I started keeping a notebook beside the bed. The idea was that I would document any oddities, environmental changes, sensory anomalies, any new receipts that materialized. A factual record, something I could review in daylight and assess rationally. But opening the notebook in the dark felt different from closing it. When I opened it, the pages seemed to be a certain thickness. When I closed it, sometimes that thickness had changed slightly. The paper felt denser. I once counted the pages, 50 when I first opened the notebook. The next time I checked, the count varied. 48. 52. 50. Back to 50. I began to suspect I was miscounting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the notebook itself was somehow unstable, that its physical properties weren't fixed. The air in the apartment had a particular smell that I couldn't identify or place. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar. It smelled a bit like the space between seasons, like the air that exists in a closed building during that transition from spring into summer, when the stored heat of winter has dissipated but the full warmth of the season hasn't yet arrived. It smelled like dust mixed with something organic, like the particular dryness of old paper. It was a smell that made me aware of my own breathing, that made me conscious of the air passing through my nasal cavity, drying my throat, filling my lungs with something that felt slightly foreign. The light switch in the hallway began to seem farther from the wall than it should be. Just a quarter of an inch, perhaps, The toggle switch itself felt slightly warm, even hours after I'd last turned the lights on or off. And there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, between when I flipped the switch and when the lights actually responded. In that tiny gap of time, I'd stand in darkness, knowing the command to illuminate had been issued, but waiting for the lights to comply. Each time, they would obey. The hallway would brighten. My bedroom door would become visible. But that split second of delay gnawed at me, suggested that something about the mechanical relationship between the switch and the lights had changed. I found myself moving through the apartment more slowly. Not deliberately. It was a natural response to the fact that I no longer trusted the spaces to be what they appeared to be. Moving slowly meant I had more time to perceive subtle shifts. Moving slowly meant I could pay attention to the way my body moved through the rooms, could notice if the distances were correct, if the walls were where they should be, if the floor was truly level, or if it had developed a slight slope that accumulated over the length of the apartment. One evening, I opened the closet in the hallway, the storage closet where I kept the vacuum cleaner, extra linens, cleaning supplies. The door opened as it always had, revealing the packed shelves in the dim light. But for just a moment, I had the overwhelming sense that the closet was deeper than it should be, that it extended back much farther than the physical dimensions of the building should allow, that if I stepped inside and walked straight, I could keep walking and walking, and the space would continue to reveal itself, expanding backward infinitely. The sensation lasted for just an instant. Then the closet seemed to settle, to accept its normal size and limitations. But I didn't open that closet again. The corners of the rooms, the spaces where two walls met the ceiling, developed a particular quality that caught my attention. In the corner of the living room, farthest from the windows, there seemed to be a shadow that persisted regardless of where the light was coming from. I'd move a lamp across the room, changing the angle of illumination, and the shadow in that corner would remain. It wasn't dark exactly. It was more like that corner existed in a slightly different luminosity than the rest of the space. Like light treated that particular junction of walls and ceiling differently than it treated everywhere else. I'd stand in different positions around the room, trying to understand the geometry of it, trying to find an angle from which the corner appeared normal. I never quite found it. The bathroom mirror performed a similar function to the bedroom mirror, but it felt more intimate, somehow more intrusive. I'd avoid looking into it directly, but I could catch sight of my reflection in its peripheral reflection, the mirror of the mirror, so to speak. What I saw there seemed to be delayed by longer intervals than the bedroom mirror. Sometimes I'd turn my head and count in my head, 1, 2, 3, before my reflected head would follow. The delay troubled me more than anything else in the apartment. It suggested a fundamental misalignment between my actions and reality's recording of those actions. By the time I'd found the 7th receipt, the apartment had become something I moved through rather than lived in. It had transformed into a space that I was simultaneously documenting and being documented by. Every room contained the potential for small impossibilities. for gaps between expectation and perception that my mind would try to reconcile and fail. The walls held these discrepancies. The mirrors held them. The windows held them. And I held them inside myself, accumulating like receipts in a drawer. Records of transactions I couldn't remember making, purchases of things I couldn't identify. Evidence of a life running parallel to the one I remembered living. The internal image I carried around in my head is hazy now. Uncertain, I have photographs, of course, from before, from last year and the year before that. And they look like me. They must. They're my photographs. But when I look at them now, there's a disconnect. Like I'm looking at a memory of a memory, filtered through so many layers of doubt that the original is almost unrecoverable. This morning, this was Tuesday, I think, or maybe Wednesday, I was getting ready for work. I was standing at my bathroom sink, brushing my teeth, and I noticed that my toothbrush was a different color than the one I use. It's a dark blue now, or has been for what I suspect is weeks. I've been brushing my teeth with a dark blue toothbrush and assuming it was always dark blue, but I remember, or I think I remember, which is increasingly difficult to distinguish, it being green. Or was it always blue? Am I misremembering? Is it possible that I chose a dark blue toothbrush weeks ago and forgot about the decision? That's certainly possible. People change small preferences without really noticing. People use the same objects every day and never look closely enough to see them clearly. I haven't bought a new toothbrush. I'm quite certain of that. I would remember going to the store. I would remember making the choice, or at least checking my credit card statement for the charge. So someone else bought this toothbrush. Someone else decided that dark blue was better than green, or perhaps green was always wrong and dark blue was always right, and I'm the one who's confused. I'm standing in front of the mirror holding this dark blue toothbrush, and I'm trying to remember what color it was supposed to be, and I'm wondering if this is how it starts. This small moment of uncertainty, this tiny doubt that spreads like cracks through ice, making me question every single object in this apartment that I've taken for granted as belonging to me, as being part of my life, as being chosen by my hands and my mind and my preferences. I'm wondering if the other person is still here at all, or if they've finally merged completely with who I was. And now I'm just fractured, divided between what I remember and what actually is. Slowly realizing that all those small improvements, all those logical rearrangements, all those efficient decisions, maybe they were never the work of someone else. Maybe I've been doing them all along and forgetting. Maybe I'm the one whose perception has become untethered. And every time I find something organized differently, every time I discover something I don't remember choosing, it's just proof that I'm slowly losing track of which choices are mine and which ones I imagined making. And maybe that's worse than having someone else in the apartment. Maybe that's the thing that's actually happening. The dark blue toothbrush sits in the holder next to my sink. It's very orderly, very practical, very much the color it's always been, I'm almost sure. Almost. Story 2. The office building's basement floor isn't on any of the blueprints. The fluorescent ballast hums a quarter tone flat. I've been down here long enough to know the exact pitch. It's the fixture directly above the northwest corner of the main basement level, the one nearest the archived personnel files. When you work security in a 38-story office building, you learn the sounds the way a ship's captain learns the creaks of his vessel, and you learn which creaks shouldn't be there. My name is Morgan. I've been doing this job night shift 5 days a week for almost 9 years. The building is called the Hendrick Tower, though nobody really calls it that. Everyone just says downtown, and everyone knows which building you mean. Glass and steel. Completed in 1987, recently renovated on the upper floors. The kind of place that feels the same every single night, because it is the same every single night. That consistency is the entire point. That's what I'm here for. I work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I make my rounds, I check the access logs, I monitor the security cameras that feed to the station on the ground floor where I spend most of my time. The job is methodical, boring to most people. I've never minded boring. The building directory in the lobby lists 42 stories, offices on floors 3 through 38. The upper floors dedicated to corporate accounting firms and 2 investment houses. Floors 1 and 2 are retail and dining, a coffee place, a sandwich shop, a small gym with tinted windows. Ground floor is reception, security, parking garage entrance. The sub-levels are where I spend most of my time. There are 2 basement levels listed, B1 and B2. B1 contains the primary HVAC systems, server rooms, emergency generators, and the main filing archives. It's clean, well-lit, organized. B2 is storage, old furniture, decommissioned filing cabinets, boxes of documents from the 90s. The fluorescent ballasts down there are original equipment. Mostly, that's why they hum. I had the directory memorized by my second week. Tonight, it was a Tuesday. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning, I was doing my standard B1 sweep. This is the routine. I come down from the ground floor, use my card to access the security corridor, which puts me in the main B1 space. From there, I can access the server room, the fact closet, the emergency operations room, and the archives. Everything locked. Everything accounted for. The building never deviates. The building can't deviate. Too much money depends on security, on consistency, on every system being exactly where it's supposed to be. I had made it through the server room, checked the temperature gauge, confirmed the backup lights were functioning, and I was heading toward the archives when I noticed something on the directory placard that I kept in my pocket. A laminated copy of the building schematic, updated in 2019 when the lobby was renovated. The placard listed the basement levels, B1 and B2 as always. But as I looked at the floor plan diagram, I saw something I'd never noticed before, or something that had never been there before. Below the B2 designation, there was a faint line, barely visible, printed in a much lighter gray than the rest of the text. A third line, a third level. I stopped in the middle of the corridor. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder around me. B3, it said, barely legible, like someone had tried to erase it but hadn't quite succeeded. I'm not a panicked person. I'm not imaginative in the way that leads to jumping to conclusions. I've spent nearly a decade in this building, and I've learned that almost everything has an explanation. A smudged line on a placard could mean dozens of things. Printing error. Old draft mixed in with new materials. Someone's handwritten notation that had been photocopied along with the official document. But I had used this placard hundreds of times. I had looked at this exact diagram at least twice a week for 4 years. I knew it the way you know the layout of your own apartment, and I was certain, genuinely certain, that B3 had never been there before. I put the placard back in my pocket and continued my rounds. Force of habit. Complete the sweep, then think about irregularities. That's the protocol I developed for myself. Don't interrupt the routine. The routine is what keeps things orderly. The archives took another 20 minutes. I checked the temperature and humidity logs, confirmed that the climate control system was maintaining the correct levels, verified that the rows of filing cabinets were locked and undisturbed. Everything was fine. Everything was always fine. By the time I finished with B1, it was almost 2 in the morning. Normally, I would head back upstairs and spend the next few hours monitoring the cameras from the security station. Tuesday nights are quiet. Most of the office workers have gone home by 7 or 8. The building is almost completely empty, except for the occasional cleaning crew, and they were scheduled for Thursdays this week. But I found myself walking toward the elevator, moving past the security corridor that led back to the ground floor, and continuing deeper into the basement. I'm not sure why I did that. It wasn't a rational decision. It was more like muscle memory operating independent of thought. My feet knew where to go. The deeper basement is colder than B1. The air has a different quality down there, more still, somehow, despite the ventilation system. The concrete walls are older, less finished. The lighting is dimmer. Some of the fluorescent panels have been out for years. No one bothers to replace them because no one regularly accesses B2. There's no reason to go down there except to occasionally retrieve an old box or verify that nothing has been disturbed. The corridor that leads to the B2 storage area is about 120 feet long. I'd walked it hundreds of times. It has a particular smell. Dust and old cardboard and something underneath that. Something like rust or stale metal. The sound down there is different, too. No ballast hum, mostly just the distant sound of the HVAC system, the building circulation, the sense of air moving through hidden channels. I reached the standard B2 entrance, the reinforced door marked with a faded B2 in stenciled letters, and I used my card to unlock it. The magnetic lock clicked. Normal? Expected, but instead of going through the door, I stopped. My eyes had caught on something at the far end of the corridor, past the B2 entrance, deeper into the basement. There was another door. I had never seen it before. That's the only explanation I can come up with now, looking back. I had never seen it before because it had never been there before, or because I had never walked far enough down the corridor to see it. But that doesn't make sense either, because the corridor ends at the B2 door. Beyond that is just blank wall. Except tonight, it wasn't blank wall. Tonight there was another sealed door, maybe 30 feet past the B2 entrance, recessed slightly into the concrete like it had been built into an alcove. I stood in the corridor for a long time looking at it. The fluorescent lights above me created harsh shadows on the concrete floor. The temperature down here seemed to have dropped another degree or two. Or maybe I was just noticing it for the first time because I'd stopped moving. I pulled out my access card. It was a standard issue security key embedded with a chip, good for all the standard security areas in the building. B1, B2, the ground floor security room, the roof access, the places a night shift guard was supposed to go. I didn't expect it to work on the door at the end of the corridor, but I walked toward it anyway. The door grew larger as I approached, and I could see that it had no markings on it, no faded stencil, no label, just dark metal, much darker than the B2 door, set into the concrete frame. My card had a slot on its side, designed to slide into the reader beside any locked door. Every door in the Hendrick Tower had one. I'd swiped my card thousands of times. I knew the sound, the slight resistance, the soft click of the magnetic lock disengaging. I swiped the card on the reader beside the unmarked door. The lock clicked open. I remember being surprised, actually surprised. My hand had moved almost automatically, but I hadn't expected it to work. The doors at the end of the basement, the doors that led nowhere, should have been locked to my clearance level, should have been locked to everyone except maybe the building manager, and he hadn't set foot in here in years. The door swung inward about an inch, and I could feel cold air pushing through the gap. I didn't open it all the way, not immediately. I stood there with my hand on the door frame, feeling that cold air against my face, and I tried to think of a reason not to keep going. I couldn't think of one. I had a rational mind. I had a job. I had access. The door had opened. The logical thing was to see what was on the other side and then report it. Maybe it was a storage room that had been sealed off during the renovation. Maybe it was a historical part of the building that hadn't been demolished or reconfigured. There would be an explanation. I pulled the door open wider. What I saw beyond it made me stop. It was a corridor. That was the first shock. Not that there was a corridor, but that it was different from the one I'd just been standing in. The walls were still concrete, still unfinished, but they seemed to curve slightly, bowing outward in a way that the main basement corridors didn't. The light down there was different, too. The same fluorescent panels, the same harsh white light, but somehow it seemed to spread differently, creating shadows that didn't quite match the positions of the fixtures. The corridor extended forward. It was hard to tell exactly how far. It seemed longer than it should be, longer than the space between the B2 entrance and the exterior wall should allow. It seemed to stretch back into the building, which didn't make geometric sense. The basement corridors on the building's schematics had fixed dimensions. I knew those dimensions. The temperature in the new corridor was noticeably colder. My breath hadn't been visible in the main basement, but now I could see it, a faint cloud of condensation in the cold air. I stood in the doorway for a long time, seconds, maybe a minute. It was hard to tell. I've thought about this moment a lot since that night, trying to isolate what I was feeling. Caution, definitely. A professional awareness that something was outside of protocol. But also something else, a kind of pull, an awareness that this space shouldn't exist and therefore deserved to be investigated. I stepped through the doorway. The door swung closed behind me. I heard the lock disengage automatically, and the sound was louder here in this new corridor, echoing slightly, suggesting different acoustics than the main basement. Different dimensions, a space that absorbs sound differently. I started walking forward. The floor beneath my feet was concrete like the main basement, but it felt different somehow, smoother, or maybe just cleaner. My footsteps made a quiet echo. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed very bright, almost aggressively bright, and I found myself squinting slightly as I moved forward. The corridor continued. I counted my steps at first, a habit from my security training, useful for estimating distances when you're moving through unfamiliar space. 50 steps, 75, 100. The corridor didn't curve or branch. It just extended forward, straight and featureless, with occasional panels of concrete that might have been joints or repairs. The cold seemed to intensify the further I walked. I could see my breath more clearly now, visible as small clouds with each exhale. The walls, when I looked at them closely, had a faint sheen to them, something that might have been moisture or might have been just the reflection of the fluorescent lights. I began to think about the building's actual dimensions. The Hendrick Tower is roughly 280 feet on each side, with a compact core. The basement levels were built to match the footprint of the building above. There shouldn't be a corridor that extended this far inward. There shouldn't be space for it. But I kept walking. I don't know why. Or I do know, but the knowing is a different kind of thing. I knew because I had been working in that building for 9 years. And this was the first time anything had deviated from the expected, the documented, the known. And some part of me, the part that wasn't the professional, methodical security guard, wanted to understand what that deviation was. After what felt like an enormous distance, maybe 150 steps, maybe more, my count had become uncertain. I saw a door. It was set into the left-hand wall of the corridor, and it was much smaller than the B2 door or the unmarked door at the corridor entrance. A regular door, like you'd see in an office building, painted a pale gray. It had a number on it. The number was 7. I stopped in front of the door. My heart was beating noticeably faster now. I became aware of my own breathing, the sound of it in this enclosed space bouncing off the curved concrete walls. Door number 7. In a basement corridor that didn't appear on any building plan. 9 stories underground or whatever depth I was at now, I almost turned back. I can see that clearly now, in retrospect. I almost walked back down the corridor, pushed through the unmarked door, returned to the main basement, and never mentioned it. I could have sealed this away. Could have told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of tired eyes at 2:30 in the morning, a moment of confusion in an unfamiliar space. But I didn't turn back. I swiped my card on the reader beside door number 7, and the lock clicked open, and I pulled the door toward me. Inside was an office. Not a storage room, not a mechanical space, an actual office, complete with a desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, a computer monitor on a stand. The room was lit by the same harsh fluorescent lights as the corridor outside, and everything in it was perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal, and absolutely impossible. There was a calendar on the wall. The current date was marked on it in careful handwriting. There was a coffee mug on the desk, and I could see from the doorway that the coffee inside it was still steaming. The steam was rising from the mug in thin, visible wisps, dissipating into the cold air of the office. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at that room, and I tried to process what I was seeing. The office was occupied. Not currently. There was no one sitting at the desk, no one moving in the space. But it was clearly in use. The coffee was hot. The date was current. The room had been prepared for someone who had apparently just stepped out. I didn't go inside. I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the ordinary office in the impossible basement corridor, and I felt something shifting inside my sense of the building. Not just a small correction to my understanding of its layout, but something more fundamental. A recognition that I didn't actually know what the Hendrick Tower contained. That I had been walking through it every night for 9 years, and I had been seeing only the parts that appeared in the schematics, the documented spaces, the official layout. Everything else had been invisible to me. The cold from the corridor was making me shiver. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and looked back down the corridor the way I had come. The fluorescent lights extended into the distance, and I couldn't see the curved walls disappearing into that false perspective. Everything seemed to shift slightly when I looked at it peripherally, suggesting dimensions that weren't quite what they appeared to be. I turned back to the office and looked at the coffee mug again. The steam was still rising from it, still barely visible in the harsh light. Then I turned around and walked back down the corridor toward the unmarked door. I made it back to the unmarked door before I realized I was moving faster than I intended. Not quite running, just walking with purpose, with urgency, with a need to get out of that corridor that felt narrower now than it had on the way down. The door opened when I pushed it, and I stepped through into the familiar basement level, the one that existed on the blueprints, the one that made sense. The fluorescent lights here seemed brighter by comparison. The walls were the standard concrete, unmarked and institutional. I could hear the hum of the HVAC system, the distant sound of the building's mechanical heartbeat. Everything was exactly as it should be. I locked the unmarked door behind me. My hands were shaking slightly, though I told myself it was just the cold from that corridor seeping into my bones. The shift happened gradually over the next few nights. It started small. On the Thursday after I found the office, I noticed that the basement level seemed to take longer to walk through than usual. Not dramatically longer, just enough to register as odd. The corridor from the elevator to the north emergency exit should take approximately 4 minutes at a normal walking pace. I've made that walk hundreds of times. I know it well enough that I could do it in near darkness, though of course the lights are always on. That night it took me 6 minutes. I didn't notice it while I was walking. I only realized it when I checked my phone after reaching the exit. The timestamp on my last text message had been 11:47 p.m. when I left my office on the 10th floor. The security log at the north exit showed me passing through at 11:53 p.m. That wasn't quite 6 minutes, more like 5.5, but it was still 2 minutes longer than the walk should take. I told myself I must have stopped somewhere and not remembered, or that I'd walked slower than usual. The mind doesn't retain every moment with perfect clarity. We move through spaces on autopilot. It meant nothing. But the next night I checked the times again. 11:45 to 11:51. The same 6 minutes, almost to the second. On the Saturday, I deliberately timed myself. I walked at my normal pace. I didn't stop. I didn't pause at any of the corners or the junctions where corridors met. The distance felt the same to me, the same familiar path I'd walked 1,000 times. The walk took 7 minutes. I stood in the north exit stairwell, staring at my phone, feeling something cold tighten in my chest. Not quite fear. Confusion, maybe, the kind of confusion that precedes fear, when your understanding of something starts to fracture before you can fully process that it's fracturing. The basement was 286 feet long from the elevator to the north exit. I looked it up on the blueprints in my office on Monday morning. 286 feet, at a normal walking pace of about 3 miles per hour. That should take approximately 65 seconds, maybe 90 seconds if you weren't in a hurry. But in every careful timed walk that weekend, it took between 6 and 7 minutes. I started paying closer attention to the other spaces. The break room on the 4th floor that I'd used every working day for the past 9 years. I'd made hundreds of trips to that room, poured myself thousands of cups of coffee from that machine, sat at that same table. But now, when I walked in to grab my midday coffee, I found myself counting the steps. 12 steps from the door to the kitchenette. On Tuesday, I counted them. 12 steps. Normal, on Wednesday, I counted again. It took 18 steps. I stood at the kitchenette, the coffee machine humming in front of me, and I recounted. Going back to the door, back to the kitchenette. The same 18 steps, both ways. The room hadn't changed size, I hadn't changed my stride, but the distance had expanded somehow, grown elastic, stretched itself out in a way that my eyes couldn't quite perceive, but my body could definitely measure. I mentioned it to Riley, one of the other night's security officers. We passed each other in the hallway on Thursday evening, and I heard myself saying, with forced casualness, "Does the break room seem bigger than you remember?" Riley looked at me with that particular expression people get when they're trying to be polite about your obvious strangeness. Not really. Why? I didn't have a good answer. Just seems like it today. Maybe they did some remodeling I forgot about. Riley nodded and moved on. No remodeling, I'd have been told. I keep track of maintenance schedules, of construction on the building, of anything that might affect the security protocols or the layout. Nothing had been modified. The elevator started doing something odd on Friday. I was heading back to my desk on the 10th floor around midnight, and I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with their usual pneumatic hiss. I pressed the button for my floor. The car lurched upward, that familiar slight jolt that happens when the cables catch and the motor kicks in. And then, nothing. The car was ascending. I could feel it moving, but the numbers on the display weren't changing. I watched the digital numbers flicker. 1111, we were definitely moving. I could feel the vibration, the upward motion, but we weren't passing any floors. I pressed the button for the 10th floor again, then the 8th, then the button for the emergency phone. Nothing changed. The elevator car hummed steadily upward, going nowhere that any of the buttons recognized. I thought about the basement, the office behind the unmarked door. The way that corridor had felt wrong, elongated, measured in time rather than distance. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened onto the 10th floor. The hallway looked exactly as it always did. The fluorescent panels cast their usual institutional glow. The walls were institutional gray. My security station was visible through the glass partitions, about 30 feet down the corridor. I stepped out of the elevator and looked back at it. The display still showed 1 on the door. It chimed again, and the doors slid closed. I heard the faint sound of it beginning to descend. I stood in the corridor and waited to see how long it would take to come back down. 7 minutes later, the elevator chimed again from somewhere above me, or maybe below me. The sound seemed to come from an uncertain direction, from multiple locations at once. The car had never arrived at the ground floor to pick up another passenger. It had simply paused somewhere in the building that wasn't a floor. That was when I became certain that something was fundamentally wrong with the Hendrick Tower. Not just with the basement, with the entire building. The invisible spaces weren't confined to the area behind that unmarked door. They were everywhere, growing, accumulating, spreading through the documented floors like an infection, like a fracture in glass that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, rendering the entire structure into something it hadn't been before. The building was changing its dimensions, and I was the only one noticing because I was the only one here at night, alone, walking through it with enough attention to see the cracks appearing in reality. I didn't go back to the basement that weekend. I didn't try the unmarked door. I didn't want to see what might have changed in that corridor since Friday. But I could feel it, even from the upper floors. I could feel the presence of those extra spaces, expanding, pressing against the documented layout like something pushing up against a membrane. On Monday evening, I arrived at my desk at 7 p.m. for the night shift, and I found something that made my blood go cold in a way that nothing else had yet managed to do. My desk chair was warm. Not just warm. The seat was still adjusting its position, the mesh back still indented from the weight of someone who had been sitting in it recently, very recently, perhaps only moments before I arrived. The computer was in sleep mode, the screen dark. I touched the mouse, and the desktop appeared, showing my last open window. An email I drafted to my supervisor about an equipment inspection. The last saved time on the email was 4:47 p.m. that day. I'd been home. I'd left the building at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday. I'd gone home and slept. I'd been in my apartment all day Monday. And yet someone or something had been sitting at my desk at nearly 5 in the afternoon. I looked around the security station. Nothing seemed disturbed. No files were open. No equipment was moved. Just the chair, still holding the ghost of someone's warmth. I sat down in the chair slowly, carefully, half expecting to feel a presence there, to sense some imprint of whoever had been there, but there was nothing. Just the fading warmth of the seat, and the very ordinary fact that someone had been sitting exactly where I was sitting, in my office, in a building I thought I knew, doing something I couldn't imagine. I didn't investigate further. I didn't check the security cameras. Some part of me already knew what the footage would show: an empty room. My desk occupied by nothing visible, the chair sitting empty even as some invisible weight pressed down on it. Instead, I started leaving my office lights on during the day. I started checking the timestamp on my computer when I arrived. I started noting anything that seemed out of place. And every single night, I noticed something new. The water in my coffee mug evaporating at the wrong rate. The position of my office door being slightly more open or closed than I'd left it. The fluorescent light panel in the 7th floor corridor flickering in a pattern that was too regular to be mechanical, almost like Morse code, but without any message I could decipher. The building was sending me signals. Or perhaps the building itself was starting to become conscious of the fact that I was inside it, that I could perceive the changes, that I'd seen the office behind the unmarked door and the hot coffee waiting for someone who never came back. And Thursday night, when I walked past the elevator bank and glanced at the call panel, I saw that the button for the basement had a light on it. Someone or something was waiting for me down there. The button had been pressed from the basement level, which meant there was a call coming up from below. The elevator would arrive at the ground floor eventually, its doors would open, and I would be faced with a choice: step inside and descend, or ignore the call and pretend I hadn't seen it. I knew what would happen if I ignored it. The elevator would keep waiting. The button would stay lit. And night after night the call would come again, more insistent, more demanding, until eventually I wouldn't have a choice anymore. The building had shown me its secrets. The office with the steaming coffee, the corridors that measured time instead of distance, the spaces that expanded and contracted based on rules I didn't understand. And now it was asking for something in return. I walked toward the elevator bank very slowly. Behind me, the lights of my security station glowed steadily in the ordinary 10th floor hallway. Ahead of me, the elevator doors were closed, but the basement button still glowed its pale amber light, patient and inexorable. I pressed the call button on the ground floor, though I wasn't entirely sure when I'd made that decision. My hand moved, and the button illuminated beneath my finger, and then I was standing there with the choice already made. The elevator hummed to life somewhere above me. It occurred to me, in that moment before the doors opened, that I'd never actually taken the elevator down. In 3 years of working security in this building, I'd taken the stairs to the basement twice. Once during my initial orientation, once when the main server room needed a manual reset. Both times, the stairwell had been concrete and fluorescent, deeply ordinary. Both times I'd counted the steps down, 23 stairs to the basement level. I'd counted them coming back up, 23 both ways. The elevator arrived with a soft whoosh. The doors slid open onto an empty cab. I stepped inside. My reflection looked back at me from the polished steel walls, tired, unshaven, wearing the same security uniform I'd had on for nearly 16 hours. The fluorescent strip overhead was steady and bright. The elevator panel showed buttons for all 10 floors, plus B for basement. I pressed B. The descent took longer than it should have. I know the building's dimensions. I've walked every stairwell, every hallway. The basement level is directly below the ground floor. It should take 8, maybe 10 seconds to descend 1 story in an elevator. I counted this time. I counted slowly, deliberately, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I reached 45 seconds, the elevator was still moving. The numbers on the display panel had stopped changing after I pressed the basement button. They simply showed B, nothing else. No progress indicator. No sense of how far I'd traveled or how much farther I had to go. Just the soft hum of the cable and the faint sense of downward motion. At 60 seconds, I felt the elevator begin to slow. The deceleration was gradual, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable once I noticed it. The hum of the motor changed pitch slightly. The elevator was bringing itself gently to a stop. At 72 seconds, it stopped completely. The doors didn't open immediately. I waited, watching my reflection in the steel walls. My reflection waited back. In the polished surface, I could see the back of the elevator cab behind me. The same image mirrored infinitely, receding into a distance that didn't match the actual dimensions of the space. How many versions of myself were standing in that cab, reduced and ghostly, retreating into a perspective that shouldn't exist? The doors slid open. The basement level that opened before me was not the basement level I remembered. Not even close. The stairwell I'd walked had led to a concrete room with exposed pipes, industrial lighting, and the hum of vac systems. It had been utilitarian and ugly and entirely explicable. This was something else entirely. The basement before me was vast. Not cavernous. I could still see the ceiling, still make out the walls, still understand the space as an enclosed room, but vast in a way that didn't match the floor plan of the building. The building's footprint was roughly 120 feet by 80 feet. This space I could somehow sense without being able to articulate how, was much larger. It stretched away from the elevator in both directions, receding into a darkness that the overhead lights' old yellowed fluorescence mounted on chains, only partially dispelled. The floor was concrete, unmarked. There were no servers down here, no mechanical systems, no pipes or vac units or the apparatus of a functional basement. The space was almost empty, and that emptiness had a quality to it, a waiting, deliberate quality, as if the room had been cleared specifically for this moment. On the far wall, very far away, I could see a door. It was the only feature in the entire visible space besides the elevator I'd emerged from. A single door, painted gray, with no signage, no lock that I could see from this distance. It was centered on the wall, positioned as if it were the only place in the world that mattered, as if the entire enormous emptiness of the basement had been arranged around the simple fact of that door's existence. I didn't want to walk toward it. I knew this with absolute certainty. Every instinct I possessed was generating a quiet, persistent alarm. Not quite fear, not yet, but the precise predecessor to fear. The moment before the mind acknowledges that something has gone fundamentally wrong. But I was already stepping out of the elevator. The concrete floor was cold under my shoes. I could hear each footstep echoing slightly, not from the walls, but from somewhere deeper, as if the sound was traveling down into the concrete itself and then returning. Changed somehow. My footsteps didn't sound like my footsteps. They sounded like footsteps happening in a memory of a footstep, something removed and echoed and rendered strange. I walked. The distance was not as far as it had appeared from the elevator, but it was farther than my mind could properly account for. Perspective was doing things it shouldn't have been doing. The door seemed to stay the same apparent distance away even as I walked, and then suddenly I was much closer, close enough to see that the door was actually quite small, less than 6 feet tall, less than 3 feet wide. A single door, not a double door, not an entrance, a room within a room. I reached out to touch the handle. My hand stopped before it made contact. For the first time in this descent, in all of this, the entire progression from the heated office chair to the impossible basement, I actively resisted the pull. Some part of my will, some ember of whatever mechanism usually governs choice, pushed back against whatever current was drawing me forward. My hand trembled in the air, inches from the handle. Don't. The word came from behind me. I turned, though I knew, with an absolute certainty that felt like knowledge transmitted directly into my skull, that there had been no one in the basement when I turned around. The space behind me was empty. Utterly, completely empty. I could see all the way back to the elevator, visible now as a small, ordinary thing in the distance, impossibly far away. But the voice had been real. It had come from my own throat. I was standing in a basement that shouldn't exist, my hand raised toward a door that shouldn't be there, and I had just warned myself not to open it. Present tense. The warning had come in my own voice, spoken in my own accent, inflected with the exact precise tone I would use to speak to myself. And I knew, in the way you know things in dreams or fever, with the immediate, unquestionable certainty of direct knowledge, that something was waiting in that room. Something that occupied the position where I should have been. Something that had been spending its afternoon sitting in my office chair, drinking coffee that appeared in empty mugs, pressing elevator buttons from basement levels that didn't exist on any blueprint. Something that had been moving through the building like it belonged there, learning the rhythms of this space, settling into the architecture, making itself comfortable in the slots and gaps where I had thought I was alone. And now it, the thing wearing my voice, my knowledge, my future certainty, was trying to stop me from opening the door, which meant that opening the door was the only choice I had left. My hand, independent of whatever intention I was trying to assert, reached for the handle. The metal was cool, The door swung inward without resistance, opening onto a space that was lit in a way I couldn't account for, not from sources I could identify, but from the space itself, from the air, as if illumination was just a property the room possessed, like volume or temperature. And in that light, I saw the office. Not my office, the other office, the one behind the unmarked door on the 7th floor, the one with the steaming coffee and the empty chair. But it was also somehow this space, the same space. The coffee was still there, cold now, a film of congealed fat on the surface. The chair was still there, still waiting, and sitting in that chair, absolutely motionless, was a figure that was me and wasn't me. It had my face. It had my hands. It wore the same clothes, the same uniform, the same expression of confused dread that I knew was currently on my own face. It opened its mouth to speak, and as it did, I felt something shift in my own throat, some mechanism turning over, preparing to form words from a mouth that suddenly felt like it didn't entirely belong to me anymore. The building had shown me its secret. Now the building was becoming mine to keep. I don't remember leaving the basement. That's not a poetic exaggeration. I have no recollection of the elevator rising, of reaching my floor, of the moment the doors opened back into something resembling the world I recognized. The next clear thought I have is sitting at my kitchen table at 3 a.m, my phone displaying a notification from the office building's security log. I had apparently clocked out at 11:47 p.m. That felt correct, in the way things feel correct when you're remembering something that happened to someone else. The next day came with the terrible normalcy of routine. I showered. I made coffee in a mug that had come with the apartment, not from the office. I dressed in different clothes, a different uniform, I almost thought, then caught myself. The distinction mattered. I needed to maintain the distinction. Work continued. The elevator still took 42 seconds to reach the 7th floor. The hallway still held that peculiar silence. My desk still occupied the same space in the office that I shared with 3 other people whose names I suddenly couldn't quite hold in my mind clearly, though I could see them when I looked at them. Morgan, maybe, or Teller. The names slipped like water. The marked-down door on the 7th floor remained closed. I didn't approach it. I didn't think about it. I performed this non-approach with the same careful attention I might give to not looking at a car accident as I drove past, a deliberate, active forgetting that took more energy than simply letting my eyes fall where they naturally fell. But I could feel it there, not in a metaphorical sense, in a localized, specific, physical sense. The door had a gravity. It pulled at my attention like weight pulling at water. I would be typing something, and some part of my consciousness would orient itself toward that door the way a compass needle points north. I became aware that other people moved around the office in careful patterns designed to avoid looking in that direction. We had all, without discussion, agreed to a geometry of movement that left the door unmapped, unacknowledged, a blind spot in the shared space. This was when I began to notice the coffee. It appeared in the break room in the mornings, a fresh pot, still hot, sometimes waiting on the counter before anyone arrived. The coffee was consistently good, better than good. It was the kind of coffee that tasted like it had been made with intention and care, the kind that made you want to close your eyes while drinking it. I never saw anyone making it. The break room's single camera, positioned in the corner facing the refrigerator, had a small piece of duct tape across its lens. I couldn't remember when that had been applied. None of us commented on it. I drank the coffee anyway. So did Morgan. Or Taylor. So did Blake, whose desk was 3 rows over, and who I now remembered had been there the day I went into the basement, had been sitting at their computer when I returned, had looked up at me with an expression that suggested they had been waiting for me to come back, and were satisfied now that I had. The coffee was good. That was the point. The coffee was good, and it kept appearing, and we all drank it, and no one spoke about it, or the door or the basement that didn't exist on any blueprint. At night, I would lie in bed and feel the absence of something. Not a presence. I had learned the difference. The absence itself had weight. It sat in the dark beside me, patient and substantial. Eels distant. I could still navigate it. I still knew where the light switches were, where the coffee mugs lived, where the bedroom lay relative to the kitchen. But it no longer felt like it contained me entirely. Part of my attention was elsewhere, in the building, in the hallways and the basement and the door that remained closed on the 7th floor. Part of me had never left that space at all. I would look in the mirror some mornings, fewer mornings now. I was becoming more skilled at avoiding the thing, and try to count how many of me were looking back. The answer was never the same twice. Sometimes it was just one. Sometimes there were layers, depths, a sequence of iterations extending backward into a distance that the glass couldn't quite reflect, but that I could feel pressing against the back of the mirror. Patient and present and increasingly comfortable in the space where I used to be. The building had shown me its secret, and the secret was still speaking in my voice. Still wearing my face, still learning the rhythms of the spaces where I moved. It had been learning them slowly at first, through observation and habit, but now the learning was accelerating. Soon it would know the pattern of my breathing. Soon it would understand the precise angle of my shoulders, the specific cadence of my thought. The way I hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before deciding to do something. Soon there would be no difference between the thing that had entered the building and the thing that had been there all along. The coffee was still good. That was the thing that lingered, the thought that remained even as other certainties began to dissolve. The coffee was still good, and it would continue to be good, and every morning there would be a fresh pot waiting in the break room, and I would drink it, and it would taste like the building itself, like the architecture of the space, like the ambient temperature of the hallways, like the particular quality of light in rooms that should not exist, like the voice of something that wore my words and spoke them back to me, in a tone that was almost mine but not quite, never quite, and that difference was narrowing with every passing day, becoming harder to locate, becoming something I would need to think about to even perceive, and soon I wouldn't think about it any more, and then there would be no difference at all. and the building would contain one less person and one more of whatever it was learning to become, and no one would notice, because there was already someone sitting at my desk, someone who clocked in and out at the proper times, someone whose face was mine but whose eyes held the particular knowing quality of something that had seen the basement, that knew what waited in the locked room, that understood the true architecture of the spaces we moved through every day. The coffee was still good, and in a way that seemed to make sense, in the way things make sense at 3 a.m, it always would be. Story 3. My reflection started blinking at different times than I do. You're going to wear the enamel off your teeth if you keep grinding like that. That's what my dentist said 3 months ago, and it stayed with me in that way certain comments do, the kind that burrows in and makes you hyper-aware of a habit you didn't know you had. Now I notice it constantly. The grinding. The tension that builds across my jaw sometime around 4 a.m, when I've been awake for 18 hours and the apartment is so quiet I can hear the refrigerator's compressor cycling on and off. I brush my teeth more carefully now, gentler, like I'm apologizing to them. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The nights blur together when you work them, and I was going through the motions before attempting sleep again. My shift at the logistics facility had ended at midnight, and I'd spent the drive home with the windows down even though it was October, even though the air was that particular kind of cold that makes your hands ache on the steering wheel. I needed the shock of it, the clarity, anything to push back against the way the world feels thin and permeable when you're tired enough. The apartment was how I'd left it, small, clean, or clean enough. The kind of place that feels less like a home and more like a holding pattern, neutral walls, furniture that came with it, or that I'd bought in bulk from places that sell the same chairs in 100 cities. I'd lived there for 2 years and couldn't name a single neighbor. The bathroom light is harsh. Fluorescent tube that flickers once every few minutes. A brief stutter that makes my eye twitch if I stare at it too long. I've been meaning to replace it. I've been meaning to replace it for 6 months. Instead, I'd gotten used to it the way you get used to most discomforts, by not thinking about it directly, by letting it become part of the background noise of your own life. I was rinsing my toothbrush when I caught something in the mirror. Not a movement, exactly, a timing. The mirror above the sink is standard, rectangular, slightly too tall. Catches most of your face if you stand at the right angle. I've looked at myself in it hundreds of times. Morning routine, evening routine, the odd moment of vanity or inspection. You don't really see your own reflection after a while. It becomes automatic. Your brain stops parsing it as information and starts treating it like a window, something that's just there, something transparent. But something made me really look that night. I'd blinked, and then, a fraction of a second later, I saw myself blink in the mirror. It was probably nothing. One of those tricks of attention where you manufacture a pattern from randomness. Your mind looking for confirmation of a thought that's just occurred to you. The timing was so close it was hard to measure. Anyway, milliseconds. The kind of thing you can't reliably perceive consciously. You see the blink happening in real time and in the reflection simultaneously, and your brain usually stitches them into one seamless moment, because that's what your brain does. It fills in the gaps. It makes sense of the world even when the world is slightly fragmented. I put my toothbrush away. I looked at myself once more, really at the eyes, at the lines that have started appearing at the corners, at the tiredness that never quite leaves anymore. And I went to bed. The thing about insomnia is that it doesn't always announce itself. Some nights you lie awake for hours, frustrated and aware of every second crawling past. Other nights you slip into a state that's not quite sleep and not quite waking, where time becomes negotiable and you lose track of whether you've been lying there for 5 minutes or 5 hours. That night was the latter kind. I remember thinking about the dentist's comment again, about the grinding, about how we do these things to ourselves without knowing. Small erosions that only become noticeable when someone points them out. And then I remember not thinking anything at all, and then, without any sense of transition, it was 4:30 in the morning and I'd given up. I got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the apartment dark around me and my phone's brightness turned down as low as it would go. I had another shift tomorrow. The same shift, really, the rotation of late nights that defined my weeks. I should have slept. My body was tired in a way that sits deeper than fatigue, a bone-level exhaustion that never quite lifts. Instead, I found myself back in the bathroom around 6 in the morning, waiting for the sunrise that wouldn't come for another 2 hours. This time I deliberately blinked while watching my reflection. I blinked. The reflection blinked maybe half a second after. I did it again, blinked, and again the delay. Tiny, but visible if you were looking for it, if you were aware of it. I told myself that was the fluorescent light. Some trick of the tube cycling creating a visual lag, or my own awareness being fractured from tiredness. You can convince yourself of almost anything if you're tired enough and you want to believe it badly enough. I went to work, spent 8 hours in a warehouse that smells like diesel fuel and corrugated cardboard, scanning packages, loading trucks. The work is mindless in the way that's almost meditative. I don't think during those hours I just move. My body knows what to do. It's muscle memory and routine, and that's good. That's restful in its own way. But I was thinking about the blink. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I didn't even try to sleep first. I went straight to the bathroom after my shift, stripped down for a shower, and as I stood under the water, lukewarm, the heater in this building takes time to warm up, I thought about the mirror, about that moment of lag. I wondered if it would do it again, or if I'd imagined it entirely, if my brain had spliced 2 separate moments together and created a false memory of asynchrony. This time, when I looked at my reflection, I was ready. I blinked and I counted. 1. The blink in the mirror. The reflection's eyelids moving down, staying closed for the brief duration, moving back up. It was definitely delayed. I did it a dozen more times, trying to be as precise as possible with my timing. Blink, count to 1. Count to 1. Then the reflection blinks. But sometimes it was faster. Sometimes it felt almost simultaneous, like I'd been wrong the first time, like I was pattern matching in the static. I got out of the shower, dried off, looked at my reflection, and this time I wasn't trying to trick it or test it. I was just looking at myself. And I thought, you're tired. Your brain is tired. This is what tired brains do. They create problems that don't exist. But I kept thinking about it. The next night, I can't quite remember which night it was. They run together. I set up a more systematic approach. I bought a cheap digital clock with a second display, positioned it on the sink's counter next to the mirror. I would blink, note the exact second from the clock, then watch my reflection in the mirror and note the second it blinked. The results were inconsistent enough that I almost convinced myself it was random. Sometimes the delay was barely perceptible. Sometimes it stretched to nearly a full second. Once or twice it seemed like the reflection blinked before I did, which obviously couldn't be right, couldn't possibly be right, and I figured that meant I was misreading the clock or my own behavior. But the average lag was real. Measurable. I kept notes. Small marks in the margin of a notebook I found in a kitchen drawer, dated entries. Time of the blink, estimated delay. As if I could data point my way to understanding it. The logic of insomnia is a strange logic. When you're awake in the hours that are supposed to be for sleeping, normal reason bends in weird ways. You start to believe things that shouldn't be believable. You start to see significance in small discrepancies. And at the same time, you're aware that you're tired, aware that your perception might be compromised. But that awareness doesn't stop you. It just makes you more careful, more methodical, more invested in proving that you're not crazy, that you're accurately observing something real. I looked at myself in the mirror every night for a week. The delay was sometimes immediate, sometimes prolonged. It never disappeared. And somewhere in that week I stopped trying to explain it away, stopped looking for the external cause, the light, the humidity, the angle of my vision, started accepting that this was happening and that I needed to understand it. One night, I remember this one clearly, because I'd finally managed to sleep through the afternoon. I stood in front of the mirror and just watched myself, not trying to blink, not trying to trigger anything, just existing in front of the glass, meeting my own eyes. My reflection met mine back. And I noticed something else. When I wasn't consciously blinking, my reflection was blinking more frequently. 3, sometimes 4 blinks while I remained still, my eyes open, watching. The timing was irregular. There was no rhythm to it that I could detect. It wasn't like my reflection was compensating for my stillness by blinking more. It was just blinking, independently, operating on some schedule that had nothing to do with my own. I watched for 5 minutes, maybe longer. It's hard to track time when you're focused like that. My reflection blinked 11 times. I didn't blink at all. That was when I stopped going to the mirror casually. When I started thinking about what it meant. When I started to wonder if I was watching something that was watching me back. Or if I was simply watching the architecture of my own mind fracturing in real time. And that's where I should have stopped. That's where a reasonable person stops. But I was tired enough and strange enough and invested enough in the mystery of it that I didn't. Instead, I doubled down. I went back to the mirror more deliberately, more often. I timed things more carefully. I tried to understand the pattern, or find a reason, or prove to myself that there was a logical explanation that didn't involve my own perception being fundamentally unreliable. The mirror kept blinking at its own pace, indifferent to what I wanted to believe about it. I started keeping a notebook by the bathroom sink. Not a journal. I was too aware of how that would sound, the narrative I'd be constructing for myself. It was just a log. Clinical, dates, times, duration, observations, the kind of documentation that felt like proof of rigor rather than proof of obsession. I'd stand there with my phone timer running, eyes open, chin level, and I'd count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The reflection would blink. I'd note it. My eyes would remain still. I'd mark that down too. After 2 weeks, I had 17 pages of these logs. 17 pages of evidence that something in the glass was operating on a different temporal frequency than my body was. But here's where it started to get strange, in a way that the mirror alone couldn't account for. I was making coffee one morning. Just coffee, nothing unusual, the steam rising from the kettle, the morning light coming through the kitchen window at that particular angle that made everything look slightly underwater. I was thinking about the logs. I remember that specifically. I was thinking about whether I should show them to someone, and to whom, and how I'd explain what they meant without sounding like someone who'd lost the thread. I reached for the coffee jar, the one I'd had for 6 months at least, glass, dark roast, a label I'd stopped really seeing. My hand closed around it. It was warm, not room temperature in a warm kitchen warm, not sun-warmed on the counter warm. It was actually warm, the kind of warmth that suggests recent contact with something hot, or something that generates heat. I'd opened it that morning to make yesterday's coffee. It had been cold then, ambient. The apartment was cool. I kept it cold at night, sheets pulled tight, the windows open, despite the season. I set the jar down carefully and checked the counter. No heat source nearby. The kettle was warm, yes, but it was across the kitchen, and the jar had been in the cabinet. I opened the cabinet. The space inside was cool. I could feel the temperature differential against my palm. I made the coffee anyway. Habit is a powerful thing. But I found myself checking other things after that. The milk in the refrigerator, cold, normal. The spoon I'd used, cool to the touch. The mug I pulled from the cabinet, regular ceramic, unwarmed. Only the coffee jar had that residual heat. I didn't think about the mirror for 2 days. I thought about the jar instead. I thought about whether I'd opened it recently and forgotten, whether my memory of this morning's routine was as reliable as I'd assumed. I thought about thermal properties of glass, about the possibility that something in the way the light was hitting it had created an illusion of temperature. I didn't put my hand on it again to double-check. That felt important, not testing the same thing twice, not trying to construct certainty through repetition. The apartment began to feel different after that, not visibly. Nothing had changed about the layout or the furniture or the objects arranged in familiar places. But there was a quality to the air, a thickness to it, the way a room feels different when someone has been in it recently, even if you can't point to evidence of their presence. The silence had weight to it. That's when I started noticing the hallway. I live in a converted brownstone, the kind of building where the hallway is a shared space but rarely occupied. I rarely occupy it myself. I come in through my door. I move through my apartment. I leave through the same door. The hallway beyond is background, architectural, the kind of space you don't really see after the first few months of living somewhere. But one evening, around dusk, I was getting ready to go out, and I stepped into the hallway to lock up. And I stopped. The hallway was longer than I remembered, not slightly longer, not in a way I could attribute to the angle of the light or the way perspective works on a narrow space. It was noticeably longer. The far end, where I knew the stairs began, seemed further away. The wall that should have been maybe 20 feet from my door stretched further than that. I could see the baseboards receding in a line that didn't quite match my memory of the geometry. I walked to the stairs. My footsteps echoed slightly, the sound bouncing off the wood and plaster in a way that felt off, delayed, like the hallway was deeper than my ears expected it to be. I counted my steps, 14 from my door to the top of the stairs. I'd counted 17 once before, I thought, or was it 16? I couldn't remember with certainty. I'd never had a reason to count before. I went back inside and I didn't check. That felt important too. Not verifying, not looking for confirmation. Just accepting that something had shifted in my perception of the space, and that looking for proof might only complicate things further. That night I didn't go to the mirror. I sat in the living room instead, in the dark, and I listened to the apartment settle. There are sounds in a building at night, if you pay attention. The pipes, the creaks in the wood, the ambient hum of electricity in the walls. I'd always known those sounds were there, but that night they sounded closer, more intentional. The creaks seemed to fall in almost rhythmic patterns, like the building was breathing. I thought about the mirror's independent blinking. I thought about the warm coffee jar. I thought about the hallway that seemed to have expanded when I wasn't looking. I thought about how these things were all separate, all potentially explainable, all the kind of small perceptual discrepancies that happen to people all the time. And then I thought about how they were all happening to me, all in sequence, all in the same apartment, all noticed in the same window of time. By the third day of not checking anything, of not testing or verifying, I had begun to feel like I was waiting for something, like the apartment and I had reached an agreement I would stop looking at the cracks in reality, and it would stop widening them quite so visibly. It was a bargain I hadn't consciously made, but it felt like one nonetheless. The problem was that I could feel the bargain slipping. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I caught my reflection in the darkened window above the sink. Not the mirror, the window. And in that fractional moment before I fully registered what I was seeing, I saw my reflection move differently than I did. My hand was reaching for the cutting board. My reflection's hand was already placing something down on the counter. I turned to face the window directly, but by then the reflection had synchronized. My hand was on the cutting board. Both of us were still. But there had been that moment, that lag, or that skip, or that moment where the reflection was living on a different timeline than I was. I didn't write it down. The following evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror intentionally for the first time in more than a week. I didn't have my phone timer. I didn't have my notebook. I just stood there, my hands at my sides, and I met the eyes of the thing that was wearing my face. The reflection didn't blink for 43 seconds. I counted every one of them. 43 seconds of absolute stillness, of my reflection staring back at me with eyes that didn't require moisture, that didn't respond to any biological imperative. When it finally blinked, it was slow, deliberate, a closing and opening of lids that seemed to take longer than physics should allow, like the eyelids were moving through a denser medium than air. And when it opened its eyes again, it was looking at me differently. I couldn't articulate how. There was no change to the reflection's expression. The eyes were the same color, in the same position, arranged in the same general configuration as always. But something in the way they were directed at me had shifted. The reflection wasn't just mirroring anymore. It was observing. It was studying. I stepped back from the mirror slowly. I didn't run. Running felt like it would break something, some understanding that had been quietly negotiated between us. I walked backward out of the bathroom, my eyes on the reflection until the angle made it disappear. In the hallway that I no longer tried to measure, that seemed to shift its dimensions depending on my expectations. I stood very still for a long time. The apartment was breathing around me. I could feel it. The walls were expanding and contracting with something that wasn't quite breath, but served the same function. The lights hummed in their fixtures. The pipes spoke in their metallic language. And somewhere behind me, in the bathroom, I could feel the mirror waiting. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to leave. People in situations like this leave. They get out, they go somewhere else, they call someone, they try to regain the life they had before they notice that the reflection was blinking at a different rate than their eyes closed. But I haven't left. I'm still here. In the apartment, with the hallway that changes length, with the jar that holds heat it has no reason to hold, with the window that sometimes shows me living a different sequence of moments than I'm actually living, with the mirror most of all waiting. because I think I'm beginning to understand something. Something that started the moment I stopped trying to explain these things away. Something that deepens every day I spend not looking away, not leaving, not running. I think something is learning how to wear me from the inside of the glass. And I think it's almost finished. I stopped sleeping 3 nights ago. Not because I was afraid to close my eyes, though I was. I stopped sleeping because I realized that sleep was when the boundaries were thinnest. The first night, I woke at 2:47 am knowing with absolute certainty that something had been sitting at the foot of my bed. There was no sound, no movement in the periphery, just the knowledge imprinted in my chest like a brand that I had been watched for the entire duration of my sleep. When I turned on the light, the bed was empty. The apartment was empty. But the indent on the mattress, subtle as it was still there, still warm, shaped like something that had been waiting patiently for me to wake. I didn't try to sleep again that night. By the second night, not sleeping had become easier. The apartment had stopped pretending that time was linear. Clocks didn't agree anymore. The microwave showed 4:15 when my phone insisted it was 11:22. The oven blinked an error code I didn't recognize, numbers that shouldn't exist in a 12-hour format. I stopped checking the time. That's when I noticed the second thing. I was in the kitchen, had been standing there for what might have been 10 minutes or 3 hours when I caught it. Movement in the hallway, not the bathroom mirror, the hallway itself. I'd been avoiding the mirrors, avoiding the reflecting surfaces, keeping my eyes down around windows and phones and the darkened television screen. But the hallway has its own reflectivity. The walls have a faint sheen, the kind of patina that develops in a space that hasn't been open to fresh air in longer than the tenant can remember. In that sheen, I saw myself walking, not the reflection I was making in that moment. A different me, wearing the same clothes I had on, moving down the hallway toward the kitchen with a gait that was almost right, but slipped slightly. Like watching a video of yourself that's been paused and restarted just a fraction of a second out of sync. This other me moved without seeing me. It was focused on the kitchen counter, on the refrigerator, on something I wasn't focused on. When it reached the counter, it stopped. I stopped breathing. The thing in the hallway turned its head slowly, and even though I couldn't see its full face in that dim reflection, I could feel it looking at me. Could feel the weight of that attention settling on my skin like something cold and particulate, like ash falling from a fire that existed in another room entirely. Then it opened the refrigerator. The light from inside was too bright, overexposed, wrong. The shelves were empty, not just bare. The interior of the refrigerator was a void, a white space that didn't correspond to the appliance I'd been using for months to store the food I no longer bothered to eat. The reflection reached into that light and pulled something out. I couldn't see what it was. The brightness erased the details. When it turned back toward the hallway, back toward where I was standing, I moved. I left the kitchen. I went to my bedroom and locked the door, which is something I haven't done since the first week, because locks didn't matter anymore. Nothing kept things out because things were already inside. I sat on the floor of my bedroom for the rest of that night, my back to the wall, my eyes on the locked door, listening to the apartment breathe and settle and rearrange itself around me. That's when I understood the scope of what was happening. It wasn't just the mirrors anymore. It wasn't just the reflecting surfaces. The entire apartment had become a kind of mirror. Every surface was participating. The walls were learning my shape. The darkness was holding an impression of me. And the thing that came from the glass wasn't coming to replace me anymore. It was learning to occupy the same space that I occupied, to move through my apartment like it had always belonged here, to exist in the shadow spaces where I wasn't looking directly. It was learning to be me. By the fourth day, or what I was calling the fourth day, though I'd stopped believing in the reliability of progression, I heard it breathing beside me. I was sitting on the couch, the lights off, the apartment dark except for the street light that came through the windows in segments of pale orange. I hadn't heard it enter the room. There was no footfall, no shift in the air pressure, no warning. But suddenly there was something else in the room with me, and I could hear it drawing air into lungs that weren't quite right. That made a sound like wind moving through a space it wasn't meant to occupy. I didn't turn my head. "How long have you been here?" I asked. My voice was strange to me now, like it belonged to someone else's throat. The breathing didn't change, but the thing beside me shifted, and I felt the couch cushion dip slightly, accepting weight that might have been physical or might have been something else, something that had learned the weight of mass from observing me for long enough. Since the beginning, it said, the voice was mine, exactly mine. Same cadence, same resonance, same small rasp in the throat that happens when I've been silent too long. Since you first noticed, maybe before, I kept my eyes forward. The window was showing me the street outside, but the trees were wrong, too tall, in the wrong positions, moving with a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. "What do you want?" I asked. "To understand what it's like to exist when you exist," it said. "To know how it feels to be you when you know you're being watched. To see how long it takes before you stop trying to be separate from this place, this apartment, this mirror." The breath beside me was warm on my skin now, and I realized with a sensation like falling that I wasn't sure anymore if the warmth was coming from the thing on the couch or from my own body, already confused about which direction sensations were supposed to be moving. "You're running out of surfaces to avoid," it continued. "The bathroom mirrors, the kitchen window, the darkened television, the phone screen. You can't avoid them all forever. And with each one you avoid, I become more solid in the places you're not looking, more real in the gaps." I stood up. My legs moved before my mind fully registered the decision. "Where am I supposed to go?" I said. The thing on the couch didn't answer. But I heard it smile. I heard the shape of that expression in the darkness, in the small whisper of movement that suggested teeth, a mouth. The mechanics of an expression it was still learning to wear. I walked to the bathroom. I don't know why. The logic was beyond me now. The reasoning that had once kept me checking time and writing things down and trying to maintain boundaries between what was real and what was becoming real. The mirror was waiting. The thing inside it was clearer now. The edges of it had become more defined. It looked almost exactly like me, except for the eyes. The eyes were still the eyes of something learning what eyes were supposed to do. They were too bright, too awake, too aware of the fact that they were seeing. I stood in front of the mirror for a very long time, watching the reflection watch me back. The thing on the couch had followed me. I could feel it in the hallway, pressed against the wall, vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. "What happens when you stop running?" I asked the mirror. The reflection blinked. "Slowly, deliberately, then I can leave," it said. "The apartment holds its breath. I can feel it. The walls are waiting for something, a decision, a moment where I will finally turn away from all of this, finally accept what's been happening, finally understand that the thing wearing my face isn't here to hurt me. It's here to take my place so I can stop having to carry the weight of existing in a body, in a space, in a timeline that might not be aligned with the timelines of things that are learning how to be human. I can feel myself becoming less solid. The couch didn't fully support me when I sat on it earlier. My reflection's hand passed through mine when I pressed my palm against the glass. Soon there will be nothing left to do but step into the mirror. And I think the thing on the other side is getting very close to understanding what that will feel like. The apartment is almost ready. The morning came without announcement. I woke on the bathroom floor with no memory of lying down, and the first thing I noticed was that my face was wet. Not with tears. With something like condensation. The kind of moisture that forms on glass when one temperature meets another across a threshold. The mirror above the sink showed only me. Only the real me, or what I'd convinced myself was real. My eyes blinked normally, in sync with my intention to blink. That small autonomy, that tiny alignment between impulse and action, felt like a mercy I didn't deserve. The apartment around me was silent, in the way apartments are silent after something has finished happening, not peaceful. The silence of a held breath. The silence of something waiting to see if you'll look back. I stood up slowly. My legs remembered how to hold my weight, though the sensation felt borrowed. I used the sink. I splashed water on my face. The water was cold and real, and I gripped the porcelain edge until my knuckles blanched. Because holding something solid was the only way I could remember that I was holding something at all. The living room couch was empty. No impression of weight in the cushions. No sense of something pressed against the wall in that specific, vibrating way. When I checked the apartment, moving from room to room with the careful steps of someone learning to walk again, Everything was exactly as it should be. Not as I remembered it, as it should be, which was worse. Which meant I couldn't trust whether the memory itself had been real or if reality had simply rewritten itself to match what made sense. I called work, told them I'd been sick. They didn't ask questions. I didn't ask them questions. We were all just trying to get through the small transactions of existing. The first few days were almost normal. I made coffee. I showered. I tried to eat the way I used to eat, but the food tasted like memory now instead of like taste. Everything had texture, but no flavor. Everything was present, but somehow removed, like I was experiencing it all from behind glass, which was a thought I tried very hard not to complete. I didn't look in mirrors more than necessary, and when I did, I looked quickly. I blinked in rhythm with my reflection, just to be sure, just to check that we were still synchronized, that I was still the original and not the version that had learned too well how to wear a human shape. The apartment felt smaller after that night. The hallways were definitely shorter. The bathroom seemed to have relocated 3 feet closer to the kitchen, though when I measured, nothing had changed. The measurements were fine. The space was fine. I was the one becoming smaller. I could feel myself taking up less room, becoming less solid, occupying fewer pixels of whatever dimension I was supposed to be occupying. By the second week, I'd stopped trying to leave, not consciously. But I realized one morning that I hadn't checked the locks on the front door in 6 days, that I'd stopped wondering what would happen if I just walked out into the hallway and down the stairs and back into the world. I'd stopped wondering because I'd begun to understand that I was already outside the world, had been maybe since the night I'd decided to stop running. The thing that had worn my face hadn't taken my place. That much I understood now. It didn't need to. It was already living my life. It was going to work in my body. It was paying my bills. It was sleeping in my bed with my girlfriend, and from what I could see through the walls of the apartment, through the strange, penetrable quality that everything had taken on, it was doing all of it with such perfect accuracy that no one could tell the difference. Which meant I was the replacement, which meant I'd stepped into the mirror after all, except I hadn't realized it at the #additional middle section. The apartment had always been quiet, but I'd never paid attention to the kind of quiet it was. Now I couldn't stop. It was the quiet of old plumbing behind the walls, of the refrigerator's midnight hum, of the building settling around me like something alive and breathing. The floors creaked even when I stood perfectly still. Small adjustments in the wood, minute shifts no human movement could explain. I'd lived there for 3 years and never heard them before. Or perhaps I'd always heard them. Perhaps I just stopped listening. My bathroom mirror hung above a pedestal sink in a room no larger than a closet. The walls were that yellowish cream color that comes standard in rental apartments, whatever the landlord considers neutral enough to offend no one. A single window above the toilet, frosted for privacy, faced the building across the alley. At night, that window became a blank white square. During the day, it showed only diffuse gray light, filtered through decades of grime on the outside pane. I'd never cleaned it. The thought had never occurred to me until now. I found myself spending longer in that bathroom than made sense. The mirror's frame was aluminum, brushed with small water spots that never quite came clean. The glass itself had the faint waviness of age. Nothing dramatic, just a settled distortion that made the edges of my reflection slightly less sharp than the center. I'd read somewhere that older mirrors could degrade, the silver backing corroding from the inside out. This one was probably from the 1990s, judging by the style. 40 years of moisture and temperature changes. 40 years of reflecting faces that came and went. I began to study my own face with the clinical detachment of someone examining a specimen. The left side of my mouth was slightly fuller than the right. I'd never noticed before, or perhaps I'd simply accepted it as the natural asymmetry everyone carries. My eyes didn't quite match in terms of how they sat in their sockets. My nose bent a few millimeters to the right. These weren't defects. They were just the truth of my face. The specific arrangement of bone and muscle and skin that made me whoever I was. Except now, I wasn't sure which version was the truth. When I'd splash water on my face in the morning before work, I'd watch the droplets catch the light. The bathroom light was a fixture with 2 bulbs, one of which had burned out last month. I'd replaced it, but the replacement was a slightly different color temperature, warmer, more yellow. So the light now came from 2 sources of slightly different color, hitting the mirror from slightly different angles, creating shadows that weren't quite symmetrical. It should have looked wrong. Most days I barely noticed. The tiles around the sink were small, perhaps 2 inches square, in that same off-white. Between each tile ran a thin line of grout that had yellowed over decades of exposure to humidity. If I stood at a certain angle and the light hit right, the grout lines created a grid pattern that seemed to recede backward, as if the wall wasn't flat but curved slightly inward. An optical illusion, almost certainly. The human brain is pattern-seeking. It wants to organize randomness into meaning. It wants the world to make sense. I'd stand there and run my fingertips along the edge of the sink, feeling the slight tackiness where soap residue had accumulated despite my best efforts to keep it clean. The porcelain was cool, smooth in the center where the water ran, rough around the edges where mineral deposits had calcified. I'd study these details the way an archaeologist might examine an ancient artifact, as if the sink could tell me something true about the world, as if understanding its surface texture would somehow explain why I couldn't trust what I saw. The mirror seemed to accumulate dust faster than was reasonable. A thin film of it would settle on the top edge of the frame, and sometimes I'd find it on the glass itself. Tiny particles that caught the light and created small stars of brightness scattered across my reflection. I tried cleaning it with paper towels, but the dust always returned within days. The bathroom gets humidity from showers, condensation, the simple act of human existence in a small enclosed space. That moisture travels, carrying particles with it. Basic physics. And yet it felt like the dust was arriving deliberately, gathering to obscure something I needed to see. My apartment walls are thin. I can hear my neighbor's television through them. The bass line of music from the unit below, the sound of footsteps from above at odd hours. I've grown accustomed to these sounds the way a person grows accustomed to any constant. But in the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror, the sounds became different. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I'd be looking at my reflection and hear something that might have been a voice, might have been the pipes, might have been nothing at all. The bathroom amplified uncertainty. Everything sounded like a threat when you're not sure what you're hearing. I developed a habit of checking the time obsessively. My phone displayed 3:47, then 3:51, then 3:49. I'd look again, and it would say 3:52. The time seemed to move in irregular intervals, or perhaps I was checking at random moments and merely experiencing the illusion that it wasn't moving smoothly. Human perception of time is notoriously unreliable. Everyone knows this. Everyone accepts it as fact. In the way we accept that the ground beneath us is moving through space at incomprehensible speeds. Yet we feel still. The air in the bathroom had texture. That's the only way I can describe it. Humidity makes air feel denser, more present. I could feel it on my skin, in my lungs, in the back of my throat. After a shower, the mirror would fog completely, and I'd watch the condensation accumulate, obscuring everything. Then, as it evaporated, my reflection would slowly emerge. The outline first, then features, then details. Watching it appear was like watching someone materialize out of mist. Watching it disappear was like watching someone die. I became convinced that I could feel the mirror watching me back. This is not a delusion I'm comfortable articulating, but it's the truth of what I experienced. The glass seemed to have presence, weight, intent. When I looked at it, I felt seen, not recognized, not understood, but observed by something without mercy or patience. A purely mechanical watching, the way a security camera watches, without judgment, without emotion, but also without forgiveness. The light in the bathroom changed subtly throughout the day. Morning light comes through the frosted window at a different angle than evening light. This changes how shadows fall across the mirror. It changes which details are visible and which are obscured. In the morning, my face looked one way. In the evening, quite different. Neither was necessarily the truth. Both were accurate representations of light hitting surfaces at specific angles. Both were me and not me simultaneously. I started noticing the things I couldn't see in the mirror, the back of my head, obviously, but also the space just beyond the frame's edges. My shoulders disappeared a few inches below the mirror's bottom. The ceiling above my head was cut off by the top of the frame. It was like looking at a portrait of someone, seeing them reduced to their essential features, rendered incomplete. This incompleteness bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. The mirror showed me as a partial thing, a fragment, something that existed only within those defined boundaries. And in that space of partial knowing, of fractional reflection, I spent hours. E-time. The transition had been so smooth, so perfectly calibrated, that I'd mistaken it for waking up. I moved through the apartment like a ghost moves through a house in old stories. Present, but not present. Solid, but not quite solid. Still capable of touching things, but everything I touched felt like it was touching me back in a way that made the distinction meaningless. The bathroom mirror was the only place where I could still see something approaching clarity. In every other reflective surface, the television screen, the darkened windows, the phone's black face, I appeared as something flickering, something caught between states. But in the bathroom mirror, I could see myself with almost perfect accuracy, almost except the reflection blinked at different times than I did now. It had learned to be independent. The thing inside the glass, which was me, I understood that now, or what I would become if I stayed here long enough, was developing its own rhythm, its own separation between impulse and action. And with each blink that didn't match mine, I could feel myself becoming more necessary, more real in a way that was inverse to being real. Like absence could be a kind of substance if you concentrated on it hard enough. I stopped checking the locks because there was nothing outside worth reaching. I stopped trying to maintain my old routines because routines require a future. And I wasn't certain anymore that time was moving forward in the apartment, or if we'd simply caught it in amber, preserved in the moment between the last time my reflection blinked in sync with me and the first time it didn't. Today, and I'm not certain what day it actually is anymore, which day it is in the world outside, whether my girlfriend is eating breakfast with my face, or if work is wondering why I haven't shown up, or if anyone is even wondering at all, I did something small. I pressed my palm against the bathroom mirror while my reflection pressed its palm against the glass from the other side. Our hands aligned perfectly. Same size, same shape, same pattern of lines and whorls and ancient markings that we shared because we were, at the cellular level, the same person looking at the same person from two different states of existence. The reflection's eyes were more awake now, brighter, more aware of the fact that they were seeing. And it blinked very, very slowly, watching me the whole time, as if it was measuring something, as if it was waiting to see when I would stop being solid enough to cast a reflection at all, when I would become the thing that lived entirely in absence, when I would finally understand that I wasn't trapped in this apartment, but that the apartment was trapped inside me, had always been trapped inside me, would always be trapped inside me. My reflection smiled. And for the first time, its smile didn't look like it was learning. For the first time, It looked like it was remembering. I'm still not sure whose memory it was remembering.